It was an ordinary Thursday in the small town of Meadowbrook, the kind of day that felt like any other in the lives of its residents. Evan Bishop, a millionaire entrepreneur, was pacing around his immaculate office overlooking the town's skyline. The afternoon sun filtered through the glass windows, casting a warm glow on the polished wood furniture and the numerous awards and accolades hanging on the walls. To the world, Evan had it all: wealth, success, and influence. But despite his outward appearance, his life was far from perfect. The weight of family obligations pressed heavily on his shoulders, especially his relationship with his mother, Margaret Bishop. Margaret was a woman of formidable presence, charming when she needed to be, but often manipulative and controlling in the most subtle ways. Over the years, she had shaped Evan's life according to her own vision, pushing him toward business decisions that suited her interests, rather than his. Evan, now in his early 40s, had never fully freed himself from her influence. It wasn't that Evan didn't love his mother, he did, deeply. But the older he got, the more he began to see how toxic her presence was in his life. He had tried, time and again, to push back against her overbearing demands, but each time, she had a way of making him feel guilty or selfish for wanting to live on his own terms. He was, after all, her only child. After his father's death years ago, Margaret had clung to Evan with an intensity that bordered on suffocating. She often reminded him how she had given up everything for him, how she had sacrificed her own happiness to ensure he had the best of everything. But Evan had dreams that didn't involve running his family's legacy of business dealings or always bending to his mother's will. The constant push and pull between duty and desire had left him feeling torn and isolated. He couldn't recall the last time he had made a decision without first consulting his mother, who had an uncanny way of making him feel obligated to comply with her wishes. Today, however, things were different. Evan had been forced to hire a nurse for his mother after a health scare. Margaret had suffered from a mild stroke a few weeks earlier, leaving her physically weakened but mentally sharp. Despite her condition, she was as demanding as ever, expecting constant care and attention. Evan knew the situation was growing untenable, he needed help. So, he hired Sophie, a nurse with an impressive background in geriatrics. She came highly recommended and had worked with numerous patients who required specialized care. Sophie was everything Margaret wasn't: gentle, kind, and empathetic. Evan had met Sophie for the first time just 2 days ago when she arrived at his mother's sprawling estate to begin her duties. He'd been taken aback by her natural warmth and how she seemed completely unfazed by Margaret's stern demeanor. Sophie's calmness contrasted with his mother's high-strung personality, and for the first time in years, Evan felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps things might improve. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the solution he needed. Margaret had initially been resistant to Sophie's presence, as she was to anyone who threatened her control over Evan. She was used to being the center of attention, the one who called the shots, and she didn't take kindly to having a stranger in her home, especially one who was younger, more vibrant, and independent. Margaret made it clear to Sophie, in no uncertain terms, that she was the one in charge, not the nurse. However, Sophie took it all in stride, responding with a professionalism that made Margaret's hostility seem almost childish. On this particular afternoon, Margaret was in one of her moods. She had decided that Sophie was taking up too much of Evan's attention. He had promised to spend more time with his mother, but there was always an excuse: work, meetings, appointments, and so she was left alone in the house with only Sophie for company. Margaret had become increasingly irritable over the past few days, and it seemed the more time she spent with Sophie, the more she disliked her. Evan walked into the living room to find his mother sitting on the edge of her chair, arms crossed over her chest, staring at Sophie with a critical eye. Sophie was standing nearby, arranging some of Margaret's medications on the coffee table. She was wearing the same calm expression she always had, but Evan could see the tension in her shoulders. She wasn't used to dealing with Margaret's hostility. "Evan, you're back," Margaret said, her tone cool, but there was a sharpness to it that made Evan pause. "We need to talk." Evan didn't like the sound of that. He had spent all morning on a conference call with a group of investors, trying to smooth over some issues with one of his business ventures. Now, all he wanted was a peaceful evening with his mother, but it seemed that wouldn't be possible. "I'm just checking in on how everything is going," Evan replied, giving Sophie a quick glance. She seemed fine, but her unease was palpable. "Going?" Margaret scoffed. "It's not going anywhere. You've hired this girl to take care of me, and all she does is tell me what to do. I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life, Evan. I've managed just fine for decades." Evan sighed, running a hand through his hair. This was not the first time Margaret had voiced her complaints about Sophie, but it was becoming harder to ignore. "Mom, she's just here to help," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "You know that." "I don't need help," Margaret snapped. "I need my son." "But you're too busy to spend time." "I need my son." "But you're too busy to spend time with me, too busy with this, nurse." Evan's patience was wearing thin. He had already spent weeks trying to balance his mother's needs with the demands of running a multi-million-dollar company, but nothing ever seemed to be enough. Margaret's bitterness always overshadowed his efforts. Sophie remained silent, but Evan could see the discomfort on her face. He knew she was trying her best to navigate the complicated dynamics of caring for someone like Margaret. Sophie wasn't just a nurse, she was someone who genuinely cared, someone who didn't see Margaret as just another patient, but as a person with dignity. That, in itself, had made a huge impact on Evan. But there was no denying the tension in the air now. It was only a matter of time before things would come to a head. Evan glanced at Sophie once more, her calm demeanor contrasting with the storm brewing in the room. She caught his eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, signaling that she was ready for whatever came next. But Evan couldn't shake the feeling that this was a turning point, not just for his relationship with his mother, but for everything that would unfold from here on out. Margaret wasn't the type to back down easily, and Evan had no idea just how far she would go to maintain control over his life. As Evan stood there, torn between the two most important women in his life, he had no idea that everything was about to change. One simple act, one decision, was going to shift the course of his life and, ultimately, his entire future. He just didn't know it yet. The days that followed the confrontation were a delicate balance of strained politeness and unspoken tension. Evan continued to go through the motions of his life, meeting with clients and managing his company, all while his thoughts kept returning to the increasingly complicated situation at home. His mother's resentment toward Sophie seemed to grow by the day. Each time he arrived home, it felt like walking into a battlefield. Margaret would make passive-aggressive remarks about Sophie's qualifications, her age, and even her attire, anything she could latch onto in order to undermine the nurse's presence. But Evan couldn't ignore what was happening behind the scenes. Sophie had become indispensable, not just in her role as a caregiver, but in a deeper, more personal way. The more he saw Sophie in action, the more he appreciated her quiet strength. She didn't just care for Margaret physically, she took the time to truly understand her needs, her fears, and her stubborn pride. Margaret's health was fluctuating, and though she fought against it, Sophie never made her feel like a burden. It was this kindness, this selflessness, that made Evan's heart soften every time he saw Sophie interact with his mother. He had come to realize something he hadn't allowed himself to admit before: he was drawn to Sophie in ways that went beyond simple admiration. Her calm demeanor and genuine concern for others created a contrast to the high-strung world he was used to, and it was this calm that felt like an anchor in his otherwise turbulent life. As the days turned into weeks, Sophie's role in the house seemed to take on a new shape. Evan found himself spending more time at home, away from the pressures of the business world, simply because he didn't want to miss the moments when Sophie would enter the room, her presence lighting up the space in ways he hadn't expected. He admired her professionalism, her ability to remain composed even when Margaret threw another one of her tantrums or undermined her. Sophie would nod politely and continue with her work, never letting the jabs affect her. But Evan saw through it. He saw the subtle way she'd pull away when Margaret's criticism became too much. He'd catch her eyes for a fleeting second, and it was as if the weight of the situation hung between them, unspoken. One evening, Evan returned home after a particularly grueling day at work, his mind already preoccupied with the mounting pressure to finalize a deal with a major client. The house was unusually quiet, which immediately set his nerves on edge. He went to check on his mother, finding her lying in her favorite chair in the living room, her face set in a scowl. Sophie was nowhere to be seen. "Mom?" Evan asked cautiously, standing in the doorway. Margaret didn't acknowledge him at first, her gaze fixed on the window. "She's gone," she said coldly, her voice sharp. Evan's heart skipped a beat. "Gone? Who?" "Sophie. She's gone, just like I told her to. I won't have someone like her in my house anymore. You can't see it, Evan, but she's using you." The words hit him like a punch in the gut. His mother had always been manipulative, but this time it felt different. There was a venom in her tone that made his stomach churn. "Mom, you don't know what you're talking about," Evan said, his voice tight with frustration. "Sophie has done nothing but help you. She's taken care of you in ways I can't. You're pushing her away for no reason." Margaret's eyes snapped to him, her expression a mix of fury and hurt. "No reason? Evan, she's not what you think she is. She's just like all the others, trying to get close to you, take advantage of your wealth. And you let her. You've lost sight of who's been here for you all these years. You're too busy with that nurse to even see what's right in front of you." Evan's chest tightened. He knew this wasn't just about Sophie anymore. This was about his relationship with his mother, about the growing realization that he had been living under her thumb for far too long. But he wasn't prepared for the next words that slipped from Margaret's lips. "I'm your mother, Evan. I'm the one who has always been here. You owe everything to me. If you want to be with her, you can forget about me. I'll cut you off, just like I did with your father." The mention of his father struck a nerve. Evan had always been conflicted about his relationship with Margaret. He loved her, but he also resented how she had isolated him from other people, especially his father, whose death still haunted him. Margaret had been the one to control every aspect of their lives, dictating how Evan should think, how he should feel, and whom he should be with. And now, Sophie was a threat to her control. Evan stood there, stunned into silence. His mother had always played the martyr, always made him feel indebted to her, but this was different. She was threatening to sever ties with him completely, using the only power she had left over him, the threat of abandonment. It was too much. Evan couldn't continue living in this suffocating environment, constantly torn between the woman who raised him and the one who had awakened something within him that he had long since buried, a sense of independence, of being able to make decisions for himself, of living a life that wasn't dictated by someone else's rules. That night, Evan couldn't sleep. He paced back and forth in his bedroom, the weight of the decision hanging over him like a cloud. He couldn't ignore the feelings he had for Sophie, the way her presence made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. But at the same time, he couldn't abandon his mother. He loved her, despite everything. He didn't want to hurt her, but it seemed like the more he tried to placate her, the more she pushed him away. The two women in his life were pulling him in opposite directions, and he had no idea how to reconcile it. In the middle of the night, as he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, he realized something. He had been living for others for so long that he had forgotten how to live for himself. He had been constantly seeking his mother's approval, always trying to meet her expectations, and in the process, he had lost sight of who he was and what he wanted. Sophie had come into his life at a time when he needed someone who could see him for who he was, not who his mother had shaped him to be. The following morning, Evan made a decision. It wasn't going to be easy, and he wasn't sure how things would turn out, but he knew he had to take a stand. He needed to see Sophie. He needed to talk to her. But as he left the house, ready to make a bold move, he had no idea that Sophie had already made a decision of her own. When Evan arrived at her apartment, he was shocked to find it empty. A note sat on the table, written in Sophie's neat, careful handwriting. It was brief but unmistakable. She was leaving. "I can't do this, Evan," the note read. "I care about you, but I can't stay in a situation like this. I'm not the right person for you. You have to figure out your own life." Evan's heart sank. He knew the choice he had made, the choice to stand up to his mother, and now, in a cruel twist of fate, it seemed Sophie was leaving him anyway. The very woman he had begun to fall for, the one who had made him feel alive again, was now gone. He stood there, holding the note in his hands, feeling more lost than he ever had in his life. As he read the words over and over, one thing became clear to him. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet understand. He had pushed Sophie away, just like his mother had warned him, but this was only the beginning of a far bigger storm. Evan stood there, the note crumpled in his hand, the weight of its finality sinking into his chest. Sophie was gone. The one person who had made him feel truly seen, who had filled the emptiness in his life with warmth and kindness, had walked away. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent years trying to escape the shadow of his mother's control, only to end up pushing away the person who could have been his escape. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. He had made his choice, hadn't he? He had decided to take a stand, to finally break free from the suffocating grasp his mother held over him. But in doing so, he had hurt the one person who had given him a glimpse of something real. The emptiness inside him felt like a void that was too vast to fill, and it became clear that Sophie wasn't just a fleeting presence in his life. She had become something much more. With a sense of urgency, Evan grabbed his coat and rushed out the door, determined to find Sophie, to make her understand. But as he drove through the quiet streets, a nagging thought gnawed at him: what if it was too late? What if the damage was done? Sophie had made her decision, and he had no idea where to find her. Her note had been clear, but he couldn't just give up. He couldn't let go of the chance he still had, even if he didn't know how to make things right. Hours later, after searching every corner of the city, Evan found himself standing in front of Sophie's apartment building. He had no idea if she was still inside, if she had already moved on, or if she even wanted to hear from him. But there was something in him that wouldn't let him walk away. He had been too passive for too long, letting other people dictate the course of his life. Now, he had to take control of his actions, of his future, of the one thing that felt real. He had to fight for Sophie. He entered the building, his heart pounding with each step. When he reached her door, he hesitated. His mind raced with all the possible things he could say, but nothing felt right. The truth was, he didn't have all the answers. He didn't know how to fix everything, but he had to try. He knocked once, then twice, then waited. The silence was deafening, and his anxiety grew with each passing second. Finally, the door opened, and there stood Sophie. Her expression was guarded, and she looked tired, as though the weight of their situation had drained her. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at him, and Evan could see the hesitation in her eyes. It hurt more than he was prepared for, seeing her like this. She wasn't angry, she wasn't even sad, just resigned. "I'm sorry," Evan said, his voice softer than he intended. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I was trying to do the right thing, but I messed it up. I hurt you. I hurt us." Sophie's eyes softened, but there was no warmth in her gaze. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. "I don't think you understand, Evan," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You didn't just hurt me. You hurt yourself. I've been watching you struggle for so long, trapped in this tug-of-war between your mother and what you want. But this was never about me. It was always about you." Evan swallowed hard, his chest tightening at her words. He had known it deep down, but hearing her say it out loud made him feel exposed, as if she had peeled away the layers of his defenses. I was trying to do what she wanted, he admitted, the weight of the truth hitting him. I didn't want to lose her, but I didn't want to lose you, either. I didn't know what to do. Sophie took a deep breath, her eyes searching his. That's the problem, Evan. You've been so afraid of losing someone, you forgot what it meant to live for yourself. You're stuck between two worlds, one that's pulling you back into the past and one that's offering you a chance at something different. But you can't have both. You have to choose. Evan's heart raced as he thought about her words. She was right. He had spent his entire life trying to please his mother, trying to live up to her expectations, and now, it had come to this. He was standing at a crossroads, and no matter how much he wanted to deny it, he knew he had to make a choice. I don't want to lose you, he whispered, his voice breaking. But I don't know how to let go of her. I don't know how to stop being the person she's always wanted me to be. Sophie reached out and placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but steady. Evan, I care about you. I always have. But you can't keep living for someone else. If you want to be happy, you have to find your own path. And that means letting go of the past. You can't keep holding on to her in the way you are. It's not fair to you. And it's not fair to me. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and painful. Evan wanted to argue, to tell her that it wasn't that simple, that he couldn't just sever ties with his mother. But the truth was, Sophie was right. He had been living in the shadow of his mother's expectations for so long that he had lost sight of who he was. The thought of letting go was terrifying, but deep down, Evan knew it was the only way forward. He stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. I can't make that decision right now, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I promise you, I'll figure it out. I'll find a way to stop letting her control me. I'll figure out who I am. Sophie nodded, her eyes filled with both sadness and hope. That's all I can ask for, Evan. I can't be part of this until you do. I need you to be the person you were always meant to be, not the one your mother wants you to be. Evan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. I understand. I need time. Sophie smiled faintly, her eyes softening. We all need time. But don't wait too long. As Evan turned to leave, he knew things would never be the same. He had made a promise to himself, one he wasn't sure he could keep, but it was a promise he had to try to fulfill. The journey ahead was uncertain, but it was a journey he had to take, no matter how difficult. The world was shifting beneath his feet, and he had to find his own place in it. And maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to Sophie. Days passed, each one feeling like an eternity as Evan wrestled with the choices he had made. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, guilt, confusion, fear, and an undercurrent of hope. Sophie's words echoed in his mind, you have to choose. But the choice wasn't as simple as it seemed. Letting go of his mother, of everything he had known, was a monumental task. It wasn't just about choosing between Sophie and his mother, it was about finding the courage to choose himself. In the weeks that followed, Evan's life seemed to grind to a halt. He didn't go to work much. He couldn't focus on anything. The grand mansion his family lived in felt more like a prison than a home, and every conversation with his mother felt like another tug on his soul, pulling him back into a life he no longer wanted. He spent most of his time wandering, lost in his thoughts, looking for an answer he couldn't seem to find. But the more he tried to clear his head, the more he realized that the answers weren't out there somewhere. They were inside him, buried beneath the layers of expectations and fear. One morning, after another sleepless night, Evan woke with a sense of resolve he hadn't felt in weeks. The sun was just rising, casting a soft golden glow across the city, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of calm. It was as if the fog had finally lifted. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't going to be easy, but he couldn't keep living like this, caught between two worlds, constantly torn. He had to let go. He had to let go of his mother's control, of his past, and of the image he had spent so many years building. He had to stand up for the person he was becoming, even if that meant facing the consequences. His first step was the hardest. He called his mother. Her voice, as always, was smooth and measured, but there was an underlying tension in it that betrayed her true feelings. "Evan, I've been trying to reach you. Why have you been avoiding me?" Evan swallowed hard, his hands gripping the phone tightly. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, his voice firm but quiet. "I've made a decision, Mom. I can't keep living like this. I can't keep being the person you want me to be." There was silence on the other end of the line, a silence that felt like a lifetime. When his mother finally spoke, her tone was colder than he had ever heard it. "You're being foolish. You don't know what you're saying. You've always known what's best for you. You just need to trust me." Evan's heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment. He had been preparing for this conversation for so long, and now that it was happening, it felt surreal. "No, Mom. I don't trust you anymore. I've spent my whole life trying to make you happy, and in doing so, I've lost myself. I need to figure out who I really am. I need to live my own life." He could almost hear her stiffen on the other end. "You're throwing everything away, Evan. Everything I've done for you, everything I've worked for. You're willing to throw it all away for some woman? A nurse? You're better than this." The insult stung, but Evan knew he couldn't back down now. "It's not about Sophie," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "It's about me. It's about finally being who I'm meant to be, not who you've decided I should be." There was a long pause, and when his mother spoke again, her voice was sharp, like a blade cutting through the air. "You're making a mistake. And you'll regret it. But I won't stop you. If you want to throw your future away, that's your choice. Don't come back to me when it all falls apart." The words stung, but they also set him free. As he hung up the phone, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he wasn't living for someone else. He was living for himself. He didn't know what the future held, but it didn't matter. He was finally free to make his own choices. The next few days were a blur of emotions. There was a sense of emptiness, as if a part of him had been severed, but also a feeling of lightness. He spent his days sorting through his thoughts, thinking about his next steps. He knew he couldn't go back to his old life, but where would he go? What would he do? The questions swirled around him like a storm, and he had no answers. But one thing was clear, he couldn't do this alone. He had pushed Sophie away, but he needed her. More than ever, he realized how much she had meant to him. She had been the one constant, the one person who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. With determination in his heart, Evan drove to her apartment, not knowing if she would even want to see him. When he knocked on her door, his heart was in his throat. Would she let him in? Would she forgive him? To his surprise, Sophie opened the door, her face softening when she saw him. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at him with those deep, searching eyes. Evan could see the hurt there, the same hurt that had been in his own heart for so long. But there was something else, too. Something that hadn't been there before. Hope. "I've made my decision," Evan said, his voice trembling. "I can't go back. I can't keep living in that world anymore. I've let go of everything. I'm ready to be who I'm meant to be, and I want to do that with you. But I know it's going to take time for you to trust me again." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she stepped aside, letting him in. "It's not going to be easy, Evan," she said softly. But I believe in you. I believe you can find your way. And maybe, just maybe, we can find a way forward together." For the first time in weeks, Evan felt a sense of peace. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he was ready to walk it, not as the person his mother had wanted him to be, but as the person he had finally decided to become. The journey would be difficult, filled with obstacles and setbacks, but for the first time, he knew it was a journey worth taking. The road ahead was long, but with Sophie by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of what the future held. He was ready to create his own destiny. As the weeks passed, Evan found himself adapting to his new life. It was a life that felt both exhilarating and terrifying, a constant balancing act between the freedom he had yearned for and the uncertainty that came with it. He had left the mansion, left behind the wealth and the suffocating expectations of his mother, and had begun the difficult but necessary process of rebuilding his identity. But as the days turned into months, Evan began to realize just how deep the wounds ran. The scars of his past, the years of living for others, weren't something he could simply erase. They had shaped him in ways he had never fully understood until now. Sophie was there, though, supporting him in every step. She had seen his vulnerability and had taken him in without hesitation. Her love, gentle yet firm, was a beacon in his new, uncertain world. But it wasn't just Sophie who had noticed the changes in Evan. Slowly, people around him began to see a different side of him, one that was raw, real, and unapologetically himself. Some people admired him for his courage, for walking away from the comforts and privileges that so many would have given anything for. Others, however, saw his decision as reckless, as a betrayal of everything they had known him to be. His mother, of course, was the most vocal in her disapproval. She had made her feelings clear during their last conversation, but Evan knew there was no turning back. There would be no reconciliation. She had drawn a line in the sand, and he had crossed it. For the first time, Evan felt liberated from her suffocating grip, though the weight of her rejection still lingered. She would never understand why he had made the choice he did, and he had stopped trying to explain. It was his life, his decision, and he was learning to accept that the people who truly mattered would stand by him, no matter what. But it wasn't just his mother's rejection that was difficult. It was the emptiness he felt when he thought about the life he had left behind. He missed the lavish parties, the fine dining, the world where appearances mattered more than substance. It was hard to shake the feeling that he had given up something important, something that could have brought him happiness, even if that happiness was superficial. He missed the comfort of knowing exactly who he was, of knowing that he was someone who was admired, respected, and envied. But as much as he missed that life, Evan knew it wasn't real. It was a mask he had worn for so long that he had forgotten what his true face looked like. Sophie, too, had her own struggles. While she was supportive of Evan's decision, she knew that his journey wasn't just about him. It was about them, too. They had to navigate their relationship in a world where Evan was still an outsider, still coming to terms with the fact that he had been living someone else's life for so long. And Sophie had her own dreams, her own ambitions that didn't always align with Evan's newfound desire for peace and simplicity. She had always been content with her quiet life, but now, with Evan in the picture, she found herself dreaming bigger, imagining a future that was different from the one she had once envisioned. She wasn't sure where that future would take her, but she knew she wanted Evan by her side. It was a delicate dance, this new chapter in their relationship, and sometimes it felt like they were two people trying to find their way through a maze, with no clear path forward. It was during this period of uncertainty that Evan received an unexpected phone call from an old colleague, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. The man was a former business partner from his father's company, someone who had been closely involved with the family's wealth and business dealings. Evan had never thought much of him back then, seeing him as just another player in the world of wealth and power that Evan had never fully understood. But now, with the world turned upside down, the man's call felt like a lifeline. "Evan, it's good to hear from you," the voice on the other end said, smooth and polished as ever. I know it's been a while, but I've been keeping tabs on you. I heard about your, decision to step away from everything. Evan bristled slightly at the mention of his decision, but he kept his voice steady. What's this about? He asked, trying to mask his discomfort. I've got an opportunity for you, Evan, the man continued, his tone turning businesslike. An investment, something that could help you get back on your feet, something that could make you a lot of money. I know you've been struggling, and I thought you might want to reconsider the path you're on. You don't have to do this alone. There's a way to get everything back: money, power, control. It's right there for the taking. For a moment, Evan was silent. The offer was tempting, more tempting than anything he had felt in a long time. The world that he had left behind, the world of wealth and influence, was calling to him once again. The idea of returning to that life, of having everything he had once known, felt like an easy escape from the complexities of his current life. But then he thought of Sophie, of the life they were building together. He thought of the freedom he had gained, the sense of peace that had begun to settle over him despite the difficulties. And in that moment, Evan knew what he had to do. No, he said, his voice firm. I'm not interested. I made my choice, and I'm sticking with it. The man on the other end of the line seemed taken aback, but he recovered quickly. Well, that's your decision, Evan. Just remember that the world doesn't wait for anyone. You might regret this. Evan hung up the phone without another word, feeling a mix of relief and pride. The temptation had been strong, but he knew he had made the right choice. He wasn't going back to that world. He had stepped away from it for a reason. And for the first time in a long time, he was beginning to believe that he could truly build something new, something real, something of his own. The following days were filled with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Evan's life wasn't perfect, and it was far from easy, but it was his. He no longer had to worry about pleasing anyone else, about living up to anyone's expectations. He was finally living for himself. But there were still challenges ahead. Sophie's dreams were pulling her in one direction, and Evan's were pulling him in another. They were both learning what it meant to be true to themselves, and it wasn't always easy to reconcile their paths. Yet, every day, they grew closer. Their love was no longer a mere escape from the pressures of their lives, it had become a foundation, a solid rock they could both build on. Evan had learned a valuable lesson: sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones that lead you to the most rewarding destinations. He had given up everything for a life that was still taking shape, but with every passing day, he realized that the life he had once dreamed of, the life of power and wealth, was nothing compared to the life he was now building, a life filled with honesty, love, and the courage to be himself. And that was worth more than anything he had ever known. I've got an opportunity for you, Evan, the man continued, his tone turning businesslike. An investment, something that could help you get back on your feet, something that could make you a lot of money. I know you've been struggling, and I thought you might want to reconsider the path you're on. You don't have to do this alone. There's a way to get everything back: money, power, control. It's right there for the taking. For a moment, Evan was silent. The offer was tempting, more tempting than anything he had felt in a long time. The world that he had left behind, the world of wealth and influence, was calling to him once again. The idea of returning to that life, of having everything he had once known, felt like an easy escape from the complexities of his current life. But then he thought of Sophie, of the life they were building together. He thought of the freedom he had gained, the sense of peace that had begun to settle over him despite the difficulties. And in that moment, Evan knew what he had to do. No, he said, his voice firm. I'm not interested. I made my choice, and I'm sticking with it. The man on the other end of the line seemed taken aback, but he recovered quickly. Well, that's your decision, Evan. Just remember that the world doesn't wait for anyone. You might regret this. Evan hung up the phone without another word, feeling a mix of relief and pride. The temptation had been strong, but he knew he had made the right choice. He wasn't going back to that world. He had stepped away from it for a reason. And for the first time in a long time, he was beginning to believe that he could truly build something new, something real, something of his own. The following days were filled with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Evan's life wasn't perfect, and it was far from easy, but it was his. He no longer had to worry about pleasing anyone else, about living up to anyone's expectations. He was finally living for himself. But there were still challenges ahead. Sophie's dreams were pulling her in one direction, and Evan's were pulling him in another. They were both learning what it meant to be true to themselves, and it wasn't always easy to reconcile their paths. Yet, every day, they grew closer. Their love was no longer a mere escape from the pressures of their lives, it had become a foundation, a solid rock they could both build on. Evan had learned a valuable lesson: sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones that lead you to the most rewarding destinations. He had given up everything for a life that was still taking shape, but with every passing day, he realized that the life he had once dreamed of, the life of power and wealth, was nothing compared to the life he was now building, a life filled with honesty, love, and the courage to be himself. And that was worth more than anything he had ever known. Months passed, and Evan's life began to feel more like the one he had always imagined. There were still moments of doubt, fleeting moments where he questioned his decision to leave it all behind, the lavish wealth, the fame, the power. But as he sat by the small cafe with Sophie one chilly morning, watching the world go by and reflecting on the journey he had taken, he knew, deep down, that he had made the right choice. He no longer felt the constant pressure to be someone he wasn't. He was finally, fully, and unapologetically himself. Sophie had grown into her own as well. The woman who had once quietly supported him through his emotional turmoil was now blossoming into a person who was confident in her own dreams. They had built something together, a partnership founded on mutual respect, love, and understanding. Sophie was now opening her own art gallery, something she had always dreamed of but never had the courage to pursue. Evan had supported her every step of the way, just as she had supported him. Their lives had intertwined in ways neither had expected, and it was a beautiful thing to witness. But just as life seemed to settle into a rhythm, the phone call came that would change everything once again. It was late one evening, and the air was thick with anticipation. Evan had just finished working on a new business venture, a small tech startup that focused on social good, and was feeling a sense of accomplishment. Sophie had just left for a meeting with a potential client, and he was alone in their modest apartment. The phone rang, cutting through the quiet evening, its harsh tone making his heart skip a beat. Evan, the voice on the other end, was familiar but distant. It was his father's old lawyer, the one who had always been the family's trusted legal counsel. "There's been a development regarding your family's estate. I need you to come in as soon as possible. It's urgent." Evan's stomach churned. He hadn't heard from his father's estate in months, and the last time he had, the conversation had left him cold. The whole situation had been a reminder of everything he had left behind: the inheritance, the company, the empire. The world of opulence he had once taken for granted. He had moved forward with his life, focusing on his relationship with Sophie and his new endeavors. Yet, hearing that voice again, a voice from the past that was tied to his former identity, triggered something in him. He hadn't been ready to face the past, but it seemed the past wasn't finished with him. He didn't hesitate. Without a word, he grabbed his jacket, making his way to the office, his mind racing with questions. What could this possibly be about? Was it about his mother? His inheritance? Or was there something deeper at play, something more sinister that he had yet to uncover? The drive felt long, the streets unfamiliar even though he had been here countless times before. The city he had grown up in no longer felt like home, it was as if the streets were full of ghosts, memories of a life that no longer belonged to him. As he pulled into the lawyer's office, a sense of foreboding settled over him. He took a deep breath and walked inside, determined to face whatever news awaited him. The lawyer was waiting for him in his office, an older man with graying hair and a stern face. He didn't smile when he saw Evan enter, just motioned for him to sit down. There was a tension in the room, a silence that hung in the air as the lawyer shuffled some papers. "Evan, I'll get straight to the point," the lawyer began. "Your mother has passed away." Evan's heart stopped for a moment. He had been estranged from his mother for so long that he hadn't expected to hear this news. There had been no warning, no indication that her health had deteriorated, no signs that anything was wrong. He felt a strange sense of numbness wash over him as the lawyer continued, explaining the details of her death. It was sudden, unexpected, and Evan's world seemed to tilt. "You are the sole heir to her estate," the lawyer said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Everything she owned, her assets, her investments, the family estate, will pass on to you." The words hung in the air, heavy and weighty. Evan sat there, processing what had just been said, feeling both detached and deeply affected. For so long, he had tried to distance himself from the world his mother had built, and now, here it was, coming back to him in the form of an inheritance he had never asked for. The idea of inheriting the wealth, the empire, felt like a burden, not a blessing. "I don't want it," Evan said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "I left that life behind." The lawyer's eyes widened in surprise. "Evan, you don't understand. This is more than just money. This is a legacy. Your mother's legacy." "I've made my own legacy," Evan replied, his voice growing stronger. "I've built something real. I don't need her money. I don't need her empire. I've got my own path to follow now." The lawyer seemed to hesitate, his face softening with a hint of sympathy. "I understand, Evan, but this is the last thing she left behind. She was proud of you, in her own way. And if you don't claim this, it will go to charity. It will be lost to the world." Evan sat back, the weight of the decision before him almost suffocating. He could take the inheritance, use it to further his own business ventures, and secure a future that would leave him set for life. But that life wasn't the one he wanted. It wasn't the life he had worked so hard to escape. He had learned that the true value of life didn't lie in the size of one's bank account or the power they held, it was in the people they loved, the work they did, and the choices they made. "I'll donate it," Evan said, his decision final. "I'll donate everything. Let someone else use it for something good." The lawyer nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer. "As you wish, Evan. I'll have the necessary documents prepared." As Evan walked out of the lawyer's office, a strange sense of relief settled over him. He had made the decision, and it had been the right one. He didn't need the wealth. He didn't need the legacy. What he had was already more than enough. He had Sophie, his work, and the chance to build a future that was his own. When he returned home, Sophie was waiting for him, her face full of concern. She listened as Evan explained everything, his mother's passing, the inheritance, and his decision to donate it all. As he spoke, Sophie's eyes softened, and she reached out to hold his hand. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "You've come so far, Evan. You're not the man you once were. And that's a beautiful thing." For the first time in a long while, Evan felt at peace. He had faced the past and had chosen to leave it behind. He had learned that true fulfillment wasn't about what you had or what you could gain, it was about the person you became along the way, and the people you chose to walk beside. And with Sophie by his side, he knew that the future was bright, no matter what challenges lay ahead.